They ripped it down, stone by. This was where Alexander the Great had been proclaimed the son of Zeus. Now, when I visited this, I remember sitting there, and I said, I'm going out to see what's left of it. And I walked out from this little Turkish village I was in, very remote. And I'm walking, and the sun's coming down. I'm walking through these fields, literally frog ponds all around me, frogs croaking. And when I get to the site of the greatest of all Greek temples, one column is standing, which has only been re-erected in modern times. And it's flooded as a frog pond. And this is what they did. I'm going to say something else about that. All right. Oh, this is a fascinating woman. This is Hypatia or Hypatia in Greek. She is one of the, really, it should be in every textbook. She is the first known woman mathematician, a brilliant mathematician. She wrote essays and books on Diophantine equations, on Euclid. Her father was the head of the library at Alexandria, Theon. She was a pagan. Michelangelo put this picture of her in the great picture of the School of Athens in the Stanze di Raffaello in the Vatican. There's a story that when one of the cardinals came by and asked Michelangelo to see the drafts of what he was going to put up there, and he saw this picture of a woman, and he said, "What's a woman doing in there?" And Raphael said, "Well, that's Hypatia, one of the great Platonic philosophers and mathematicians." And supposedly, I don't know how he left her in. Apparently, he left her in that one stupid story that he made it really the nephew of the Pope, but I don't think it looks like a woman. Maybe that was the nephew of the Pope. I don't know. You don't know what they were doing. All right, she's murdered. Hypatia was the daughter of the mathematician Theon, a pagan philosopher considered she was one of the great lights of the Neoplatonic school. Saint Cyril of Alexandria instigated a mob that literally ripped her to pieces. This 1885 painting is probably her about to be ripped apart. They waylaid her in the street at night and literally tore her apart. All right. One incident, another strange incident, that she was apparently, this whole world is obsessed with virginity, even if it affects pagans. If this story is true, apparently one young man wanted to sleep with her, and she ripped off her menstrual rag and showed it to him and said, "There is nothing at all of beauty in carnal desires." So we're in a whole new world now, in what we call late antiquity. St. Augustine, he was a Berber or Numidian from North Africa, learned Latin only as his second or third language. I think it was his third. His Confessions, of course, and City of God are enormously influential. Next to St. Paul, he has more influence on us than anybody else. Those really formed the theology of Christianity. He invents the doctrine of original sin. Now remember, this is over 400 years after Jesus. And they're just getting around to invent what we think of in the Christian world as one of the central doctrines of, you were all told when you're Christian, original sin. You have to get baptized because of original sin. Well, for the first 400 years, nobody had heard of it. Until he comes along and invents it, original sin. He invents guilt, predestination, and the famous story, which Bertrand Russell in his chapter on St. Augustine is wonderful. He says, This, for a young man to be so obsessed, when he was a young boy, he stole a pear from the neighboring tree. And he goes on and on about why this was the greatest crime, because he wasn't hungry. It was just the thrill of theft. And he just obsessed about this for the rest of his life. Okay, can we move on? Oh, there we go. I like those transitions, they're nice. They told me to do. Oh, St. Simeon Stylites. This guy was definitely a basket case, but they're not uncommon. His mother was a nutty Christian, and as a teenager, he decided to become a radical ascetic in Syria, moved into his cave, moved into the desert, and finally he gets original. He lives on a column, and he becomes quite a tourist site. For the next 39 years, he lived on his column. Nobody knows what he was doing up there. They would occasionally send up postcards. He would write postcards and things. Now, I'll read you this little ditty. Phyllis McGinley, she was a Catholic writer, and she wrote these poems about saints, rather amusing. And I'll read you the one she wrote about Simeon Stylites. 30, page 30. Simeon, they're just humorous little things. On top of a pillar Simeon sat. He wore no mantle, he had no hat. But bare as a bird sat night and day, and hardly a word did Simeon say. Under the sun of the desert sky, he sat on a pillar 9 feet high. When Fool and his brother came round to admire, he raised it another 9 feet higher. The seasons circled around his head. He lived on water and crusts of bread. And so one hears from Pilgrim's store for 30 years and a little more. And why did Simeon sit like that, without a garment, without a hat, in a holy rage for the world to see? It puzzled the age. It puzzles me. It puzzled many a desert father, and I think it puzzled the good Lord, rather. And now her wonderful poem on St. Jerome, I'll read you, which is delightful. She calls it The Thunderer. God's angry man, his crotchety scholar, was St. Jerome, the great name-caller, who cared not a dime for the laws of libel, and in his spare time translated the Bible. Quick to disparage all joys but learning, Jerome thought marriage better than burning, but didn't like women's painted cheeks, didn't like Romans, didn't like Greeks, hated pagans for their pagan ways, but doted on Cicero all his days. A born reformer, cross and gifted, he scolded mankind sterner than Swift did. Worked to save the world from the heathen, fled to a cave for peace to breathe in. Promptly wherewith, for miles around, he filled the air with fury and sound. In a mighty prose for almighty ends, he thrusted his foes, quarreled with his friends, and served his master, though with complaint. He wasn't a plaster sort of saint, but he swelled men's line with the Christian leaven. It capes all kinds to make a heaven. She's a Catholic, or was a Catholic, but very, very cute little dog. So there's St. Simeon. Let's move ahead. We're going to get, these are like, phew. Jim Baker and Kathy Fay there, you know what you really get with Christianity now is they raise hypocrisy to a new level of art. Since everybody is now living double lives under Christianity and nobody can really talk about who they really are, everybody is a hypocrite. Because nobody's really talking about their real sexual desires, what they really want to do. So hypocrisy becomes the center of all our lives, all right? And that was the Emperor Justinian and his wife Theodora. Theodora, you should really read the huge article in Wikipedia on her. I think it's longer than any president. And it's an enormous article. She's just so funny. She was of the lowest of the lows. Various stories. Her father was a bear keeper. She was certainly a prostitute. And Justinian marries her. Now, what's interesting is we have the historian Procopius, the greatest historian of the age. In all his public books that were printed during their lifetimes, he's full of praise for the emperor and empress. But he wrote a secret history after they died, which is one of the most scurrilous books ever written. On the whole, historians think that's the story. Now, of the many wonderful, wonderful stories I could tell you about Theodora, one of my favorites is she was obsessed with prostitutes. And she hated pimps and passed laws to get them worse and locked up. And at one point, she rounded up a lot of the lowest of the low prostitutes, the so-called 3 obol prostitutes, and sent them off to a convent. Well, the result was, after a few weeks, the girls couldn't take it and started to throw themselves off the cliff. So the message is that being prostitutes, lowest of the low, was actually better than living in the convent. So this is what Christianity was doing for them. My favorite story about her is the 7 orifices. He tells us in there that on her deathbed, as all the monks were praying around her, you know that story of her? The monks were praying around her, and and she opens up her eyes, and supposedly her last words are that she only regret is that the human body has but 7 orifices. Now, one drunk evening in Oxford, we were very far gone, and I proposed that we write a novel called The 8th Orifice, and that each of us be given an orifice to write a novel about. So I don't know whatever happened to that. Justinian, these mosaics are spectacular. They're in Italy, in Ravenna. He is a nut job. In 529, he closes all the schools of the Plato, Aristotle, and prohibits non-Christians from teaching. All right? They all have to leave. Now, we're in the Middle Ages. We're going to move ahead. This is, of course, Chartres. And I don't want you to think that the Christians didn't produce art. My theory is, maybe Freud would say this, that, you know, humans are enormously destructive and we're enormously creative. And Freud, in his, in fact, in Civilization and Its Discontents, had the famous discussion of Thanatos versus Eros. Eros being our creative, erotic side, and Thanatos being our death drive. All right? And my feeling is that no matter what is imposed on human beings, even things like Christianity, they will find a way to make it creative. And they do the best they can. I mean, who knows? I'm just off the cuff. That's my theory. This is, of course, one of the greatest of all buildings in Europe. And what's remarkable, it has all the original stained glass at Chartres, 60 miles southeast of Paris. I had a wonderful day there, actually. And we won't go into all of that. We'll skip ahead. Now, actually, art historians would kill for this slide. I was so brilliant when I made it up. Anyway, I came across, this is a very famous part of Chartres. It's the famous portal. Well, the whole, many portals at Chartres. This is one of them. Now, notice what's happened from Praxiteles. Where we had the full body as aesthetic object and sexually interesting object, the body disappears. It's as much like a column as possible. In fact, it's better not to have a body. And Oscar Wilde, who we're going to get to, said this, you know, Oscar Wilde is often looked upon as just silly and witty, but almost all his witticisms are extremely profound. This is one of his best. It says, to be really medieval, one should have no body. There. To be really modern, one should have no soul. To be really Greek, one should have no clothes. Now, behind that witticism is a lot of extremely profound insight. She was a tough lady, all right? So one of my favorites, the wife of Bath. Now we're in, air comes back into the universe. This statue is enormously important. It is the first freestanding bronze statue to be cast since the ancient world, so it's technologically extremely important. And it is the first completely nude statue to be made since the ancient world. It is Donatello's great statue of David. And it is highly, highly eroticized. All right? This is no doubt that this is not, we're not in Chartres. That was over 200 years before. Where that's finished. Now, on top of it, nudity has become an ideological challenge to Christian doctrine and asceticism. And just to add a little touch, he puts a flower on the boy's leg, which is seen to be alluding to the boy's allure as a homoerotic object. According to rumors, it was supposed to be one of his many boyfriends. In fact, Vasari tells us in his life that he was a known pederast and that all the young men in his workshop were his boyfriends and lovers, etc. Now, think of that in Robert Mapplethorpe. You know, when we had the Mapplethorpe photos, this was like Mapplethorpe's photographs in 15th century Florence. It was a shot in the eye of the church and their official doctrines. The only difference was, since all the cardinals really didn't believe it, they were buying it up. They said, this is a good thing. We were a little tired of that other stuff. All right? So we're moving on. And what's interesting is, on the top, again, this is in the Met, you can go and visit this, is again, just when Michelangelo made that, his first painting of St. Anthony, this extraordinary teenager makes what is apparently his first statue, which we now have for 10 years in the Met, in the Spanish patio, the Vélez patio. Now, what's interesting, and I'm going to, what my observation of this is, that now we see within the Christian mind a split duality. The same genius that can make the painting of St. Anthony as tormented self makes this incredibly young, erotic Eros, and then is going to go on to make, of course, one of the great icons of Western civilization, his David in Florence. All right? Totally nude. Now, you see, they get away with it by calling it David. You don't call it Giovanni down the street. You know, you call it David and it's okay. All right? So it's a little ruse here. But so what Christianity really gives us is intense internal conflicts between how we view ourselves, which you're going to go on fighting forever. All right, let's move ahead. I'm sorry. Oh, and then we go full-time. Caravaggio puts up this all-time poster of all, this is in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, and again he gets away with it by either calling it St. John or Isaac, and that was one of his apprentices, and of course who buys it but Cardinal Del Monte, one of the best-known art collectors in Rome for whom he was working, who had an incredible collection. All right, that's now in the... Now, I told you, I promised you we were going to go beyond any sexuality you had ever heard of or known about. This is it. This is a marvelous, famous, this is in Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, right near this train station. Very little visited. How many times I've sat there, you know, passing the street in Rome with almost nobody there. A few Germans. That's it. Now, what Bernini does, this is called the ecstasy, or I love this word, transverberation of Santa Teresa of Avila. Now, this is the only known portrayal of orgasm in world art that I know of. What St. Teresa is having is an orgasm. All right? She tells in her autobiography this famous story where she fell down in her convent and she sees this incredibly beautiful young angel comes and repeatedly stabs her in the heart with this flaming arrow of love. And true to her S&M inclinations, she says the pain was intense, but with each stab, the joy got greater. So what her toy closet looked like, I'm not going into. It ain't in the diary. All right, so I'm not going to... Now, what's interesting about this, you could go on giving a whole course in this. Bernini actually puts it in theater. On the side, in the church, are the patrons of the Cornaro Chapel watching St. Teresa in transverberation. All right? So we get this as theater because Renaissance Baroque Rome is theater. All right? The world is theater. If you want to see two explications of this, get Kenneth Clark's Civilization, and Simon Schama's The Power of Art has a whole hour on this, and with beautiful, beautiful photography. I'm a little leery about Simon Schama. He's very middlebrow, and he tries to be so coy and cute. But anyway, it's well worth seeing, well worth seeing. Now, this raises the question, at the same time, Milton is writing Paradise Lost. Do anybody know where the original handwritten copy of Paradise Lost resides? A few blocks from here in the Morgan Library is the great copy of Paradise Lost. Now, if you go online and you type, "Were Milton's angels gay?" you will get a very interesting article making an extremely convincing, in fact, irrefutable case that since all the angels are male, their names are all male, and since they're making whoopee in heaven nonstop, something's going on here. Now, what's interesting, Milton was very, very interesting. He was not an Orthodox Christian. He was really out there. He was an Arian. He was a heterodox. Very, very tormented. Talk about tormented. Whew. But what's interesting is he really is, in a way, looking ahead. He says what Freud is going to say is we're all imprisoned in what Freud called genital sexuality. And what we're all really unhappy about is, for Freud, we're trying to reclaim that infantile sexuality, which Freud called polymorphous perversity, pre-genital pubescent sexuality, in which the whole body was sexualized, not just the erogenous zones. All right? St. Teresa is getting that right now. She's in the transverberation polymorphous perversity. So there are some advantages to being Catholic if you hang in there. But hanging in is hard. If you want to read a fascinating discussion of all this, what's interesting about Milton's angels too is they're not having genital sex. They're commingling their whole essences. So it's really Freud. It's the commingling. I remember when I first read that up at Hunter, I took a course in Milton. I said, these angels are interesting. I said, what are they doing up there? Anyway, my way I'm going to make my fortune, I'm really beyond gay and straight world. I'm going to open up a chain of transverberation bars. We are moving beyond the tired and the old. Polymorphously perverse, transverberating, essence commingling bars. I like that. All right, the Rockby Venus is interesting. Beautiful, beautiful painting by Velázquez in London. Interestingly, not only Christians disliked this. This statue was hit by an axe by these suffragettes in 1914. Emmeline Pankhurst and Mary Richardson went in with an axe and slashed this painting to pieces. It's been restored somewhat. Anyway, it's still hanging up there. But what's interesting, and when she asked why, she said, well, because they put my friend Emmeline in prison for wanting the vote for women, and also because I'm tired of men looking at women. So it's interesting how, you would have never said that in the Greek world or the polytheistic world. Everybody was looking at everybody. Thank goodness. All right, one of my heroes, Winkelmann, the founder of modern art history. What he does along, now they've had the nude now for 300 or 400 years again. Somebody has to say it's a good thing. In his invention of Greek art, this highly sexed man valorizes Greek sculpture, culture, and civilization, and becomes one of the great influences on the Enlightenment. On Goethe, Hölderlin, the Germans, everybody read him. Incidentally, how many of you know the film or the book by Thomas Mann, Death in Venice? He's the model for Aschenbach. He's the principal model for von Aschenbach, besides Mann himself. And much of it is taken. He's also very, you know, how many of you know The Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche? Oh, okay. The Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche. Nietzsche, when he writes his famous book in 1870, in which he tries to go beyond the picture of the Greeks as nice statues, quiet. He says, hey, these guys were really having a good time back there. There was a lot of sex, a lot of violence. He changes our image of the Greeks. But he doesn't like democracy. And Winkelmann, he has a fight with Winkelmann in the book. And I think Winkelmann has a pretty good part of the argument there. He valorizes the nude, the erotic, and he's an influence. A great book is The Flesh and the Ideal by Alex Potts. All right, we're moving along here. Oh, he's also almost unknown in America, Friedrich Schiller. He has had probably one of the most influential and good influences on modern thought. In his essays, his letters on the aesthetic education of man in 1794, among the most interesting things in there, he invents the idea of der Spieltrieb, the play drive or instinct. And he says what's really essential, as I was talking about human creativity, that's probably what you would call human creativity, is this intense drive for play. What is play? Disinterested activity with a purpose, to quote Kant. It's coming out of Kant. This is going to have you can't understand Freud, Marx, the whole of kind of what comes after without Schiller. He's not easy to read, unfortunately, so read about him. Johann Huizinga, one of my great heroes, Homo Ludens, man the player. He died in the Nazi death camps. I don't think he was Jewish. I think he was Christian, but they killed him. He was professor of Sanskrit, and he wrote this wonderful book about play. And each chapter is about how one function of our lives, law, education, music, things you don't think about as play, that all of everything in life that's most important is play. Marx is going to come along and say what capitalism and daily life really depresses us about is that there's no play. What we do all day long is something that is not play. We call it work for a wage. And to restore that playtime that Schiller says is the essence of our happiness becomes the goal of Marx ultimately, although most people bury that. Okay. Oh, two of my favorites. That's, of course, Gibbon. Gibbon was, he writes The Decline and Fall of History of the Roman Empire, and what's extremely important, of course, it's a masterpiece of prose. He publishes that in 1776, the same year with the Declaration of Independence. This is probably more important. He, in the famous 15th to 18th chapter, for the first time, he says Christianity didn't succeed because of divine intervention. There were real historical reasons for it. And that was like before Darwin, that was one of the most vilified works in European literature. He had to move to Switzerland because it got too hot for him in England. This was on the other side, my teacher, Geoffrey de St. Croix, who wrote this book, The Class Struggle in the Ancient Greek World, which is a masterpiece of stuff about the Christians, the Jews, and everything. I might read you a little bit about that. That was the only picture I could find of him. Geoffrey died at 90. He was he was very proud that he had beat the tennis player Fred Perry in 1929 at Wimbledon. And I tell you, he used to keep me hilarious at tutorials. His mother was a Plymouth Brethren. I had never heard of it. I'm sure none of you know what a Plymouth Brethren were, do you? It was a small cult in England that believed that Joseph of Arimathea had brought the true cross to England and that it was buried next to St. Arthur at Glastonbury. And he said, of course, the consequence was I had to memorize the Bible. My mother read it to me by the hour. So he said, I'm sure my mother in her heart of hearts believed that the Old Testament was originally written in the King James Version. And this was my college, Magdalen. Jeffrey was at New College right across the street. Gibbon was here. This was founded in 1458, and it's just extreme. Our word Magdalen, you know, anybody know the word Magdalen? To be sorry, it comes from the British pronunciation of Magdalen. They pronounce this college Magdalen. Magdalen. There's one at Cambridge, Magdalen with an E at the end. And this is the Great Quad. Erasmus studied here, Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, Gibbon, Edward Gibbon, Oscar Wilde, and of course, C.S. Lewis. To most people in the world, C.S. Lewis, this was his college. There's a dreadful film about him in which it all takes place in this beautiful place. He was a great don of English, but incidentally, my other tutor for Cullen Hardy was C.S. Lewis's closest friend. Along with Tolkien, they founded the Inklings. So I got lots of C.S. Lewis gossip from Cullen Hardy. Very, very interesting stories. And this is the chapel. Every year, A.J.P. Taylor, the famous historian, who was a fierce atheist, used to propose at high table that the chapel be turned into a swimming pool. It's of far more use to the boys. Thank God they didn't tear it down. This is the great Addison's Walk there. Beautiful, beautiful gardens. This is the view outside my window for 2 years. Every morning, every night, I would sit there and look at the deer park was right under me. This extraordinary, except when they used to shoot them to cull them, that used to bother me. And when I used to get very drunk, I used to carry on about how beautiful the deer was to the embarrassment to everyone. Now, one of the other, we're getting near the end. Byron. Byron is one of the great watersheds in the modern world. He eroticizes everything. People don't realize Byron was also, although he was probably one of the two richest men in England, he virtually single-handedly funded the Greek Independence War, died in Greece. His maiden speech in the House of Lords was in support of the strike of the weavers. He was a very fierce, what we would call a socialist defender of the poor, even though he and William Beckford were the richest. William Beckford had to leave because he was notoriously gay and had to live in Portugal, and he was so rich that they had to even let him back into England. And here's, the mock heroic Don Juan, he criticizes everything. He is really the first British rock star. He invents the British rock star. We hear stories that women, men used to follow him down the street to rip off his clothes, like the Beatles or Mick Jagger. Or he invents that whole meme of the British rock star. Why? Oh, and my favorite quote, one of his many lovers, Lady Carolyn Lamb, says of him, he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. I would love that on my tombstone, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. That would be such kudos. All right, the Renaissance. All right, when Oscar Wilde comes up to Oxford, he wants to meet two people. One is Walter Pater, and the other is Ruskin. Walter Pater, a great scholar of Greek, a very quiet man. He invents the Renaissance virtually, along with Burckhardt in Switzerland. And in the epilogue, he scandalized. We don't realize how scandalizable Christians are when they really used to make believe they believe this stuff. And even subtle things they would pick up because they were so guilty inside. They knew what every nuance meant because they were thinking about it all day. And in this famous eclogue, one of the most famous sentences in it, at the end of the Renaissance, he says, to burn always with this hard, gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy is success in life. In a sense, it might even be said that our failure is to form habits. Now, what he's praising is hedonism. Not a word about getting your happiness in life from God, any deeper meaning. Art and love are the meaning of life. All right? This was so rapturous to the undergraduates that all the undergraduates at Oxford memorized it and started to read it instead of the Bible. All right, they had to almost threw him out of Oxford, but he was, it takes an act of parliament. Once you're made a don at Oxford, it takes an act of parliament to remove you. So you're pretty, a lot of them did nothing for the rest of their lives. But anyway, we'll move on. We're getting near the end. Now, with this world, we get the return of paganism. We get the whole, these both were in the Daesh Museum a few years ago in a wonderful exhibit. Flandrin's wonderful pictures, the nude comes back with a vengeance, and highly sexualized art. The invention of photography in 1839, the daguerreotype is going to add more. And then Engels writes, the origin of the family private property in the state. One of the great, incidentally, an exhibit you should not miss is the exhibit up at 15 East 84th Street, the new NYU Institute for the Center of Ancient Art on Old Europe. It's an astonishing exhibit, really about the world Engels is talking about, what we call mother right. Engels was using people like Bachhoven that argued very brilliantly that there must have been a stage of society preceding patriarchy, male-dominated society, which they call Mutterrecht or matriarchy. That's now pretty, although they still fight about it, Gimburtas, etc. And he argues that it was the takeover of patriarchy that introduces the idea that you better make sure the woman is only having sex with you, because if, you see, under matriarchy there's free sex. Everybody in a matriarchy is not worried about who they're having sex with, because there's no private property. Private property, when you get private property, then you worry about having one wife, one girlfriend, and she better only be with you. Because, why? Inheritance. You want to make sure that your male children are yours, not anybody else who got into her bedroom. All right? So the obsession with virginity enters, and the state then becomes the band of patriarchal men who organize themselves around a chief and then start to accumulate surplus. Anyway, it's all in there. Read it with Eleanor Oh, I should just say that. Yeah, she was a great woman. Oh. Eleanor Burkhart, where'd she go here? She died at 64. She was an anthropologist. She wrote a brilliant introduction to this book, so make sure you read that. And we'll end more or less with Oscar. There's Oscar on the left. And on the right is Audrey Beardsley. Apparently one night they were talking, drinking, and it came up about what good the Christians had done. And Beardsley said, Nero, I should tell you the story. In Suetonius and Tacitus, there's a famous story that Nero, who was deranged, of course, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but he used to dip Christians in oil and then set them on fire, and as they was having his garden parties at night, they would be lit up by the Christians running around lit up on fire while they were sitting, sipping their martinis or whatever. And Beardsley apparently said, Nero set Christians on fire like large tallow candles, the only light Christians have ever known to give. And Wilde said, yes, that was the last time Christians were known to bring light into the world. You could see why they put him in prison. Now, Beardsley is a fascinating person. He was a very ill man. He died at 25 of tuberculosis, hemorrhaging, coughing up blood, and yet he did these extraordinary pictures, he became a Christian a year before he died. He became a Roman Catholic. Well, that was a popular thing then. It was like, incense and bells and smells and whatever. And these are not Christian drawings, as you can see. That's one for Aristophanes Lysistrata, and that's his extraordinary Oscar Wilde Salome. You know what she's doing there? Do you know the opera? How many of you know the opera, Richard Strauss's opera, Salome? What she's doing there is she's asked for the head of John the Baptist because she's become obsessed with him sexually, and she wants to kiss his lips. And she's kissing the lips of the skull of the head of John the Baptist, which has been brought to her. Pretty wild. All right, I'll end with Jessica here. Jessica Mitford comes from a mad family. They went from the one in the middle. Diana was married to Sir Oswald Mosley, who was the head of the British Fascist Party. She loved Hitler, constantly went to tea with Hitler. They were supporters of the fascists. On the other hand, Jessica at the end was in Spain fighting with the communists against Hitler. It was a very, very famous British family, and I love these two quotes. She says, "You may not be able to change the world, but at least you can embarrass the guilty." So today I've tried to embarrass the guilty, and if you ask, have I been objective? I've always had an objective.
Thank you. Does anyone have a question at all? Oh, Eric, yes. We'll repeat the question, please.
You were talking about Nietzsche a little earlier. Can you what do you know about the concept of slave morality and master morality, and how does it
That's
relate
more
to the
Hegel.
sexuality,
Isn't that Hegel?
that you were talking about?
Well, one of the things he thought was Christianity was a religion for slaves, and that Nietzsche was very much into the aristocracy as the ideal. I prefer, in many ways, Winkelmann, because Nietzsche really, people have tried to downgrade how proto-fascist Nietzsche was. Maybe he himself, he lived before Hitler, and but it's very easy to see how much of what Nietzsche says can easily be taken up by the fascists. I mean, the endless hatred of working people, socialism, the praise of the master race, and even though people in America don't like to, especially philosophy dons, Nietzsche really didn't believe that stuff. Well, I don't know. So anyway, one of his ideas was that that Christianity was a religion for the slaves, and that we should get away from it because we wanted the religion of the masters, the Greek masters, I think, as far as I understand.
Right. Anyone else? I'm sure nobody has any questions because you covered it so.
I was so thorough.
We were so thorough. Oh, we're gonna. All right.
One in the back.
The lady in the back.
Yes, could you talk about the death of Socrates?
The death of Socrates.
Well, it's in the Met. The Met has the picture by David.
I know, but you said that in Greek society it was okay to believe anything you wanted.
Well, one of the things, Jeffrey, next to St. Paul, he hated Plato. And he, in many ways, Plato is and can be read as, in part, a proto-Christian. Definitely Socrates becomes one of the models for that. He wasn't himself ascetic, but the Christians are going to read him as a Christian. In fact, Erasmus says in one of his letters, every time I read the death of Socrates in Plato, I say to myself, Saint Socrates, pray for us. So what else? I'm not sure what else the death of him as a saint, or?
No. What was he accused of?
Oh,
he was
well,
accused of atheism.
The best book on that is the Trial of Socrates by I.F. Stone. The usual party line through most of history has been Plato's line, that he was killed by the state for corrupting the youth. But in fact, as I.F. Stone and Jeffrey and many others have shown, it really was a political trial because all of Plato's own two uncles and almost all the young men that Socrates had taught ended up being extremely anti-democratic. And many of them were involved in the revolution that overthrew the democracy. So what they were really doing was they wanted to get back at those guys. In fact, two of Plato's uncles were killed. They were really horrible people. Now, Plato wrote dialogues about these uncles. So one of the things we don't read Greek literature politically. And these things were happening in real political time. Plato's family was extremely anti-democratic. So he did not like the democracy. And he tries to turn Socrates into this anti-democratic hero, very mildly. In fact, we get very different views of Socrates from Xenophon and other people. So whoever the real Socrates was is hard to tell now beyond these creations of him in literature. But I think the better answer is that they wanted to put him on trial because he had educated the young men who had overthrown the democracy. And what they expected, as Plato says in the dialogue, the trial, he says, in Greek courts you were allowed to propose your own punishment. And when he's convicted in the first round, they say to him, what do you want your punishment to be? And everybody assumed that all his rich young students would simply pay a fine. And apparently, if we're to believe Plato, Plato then gives this famous speech saying that he has never betrayed the state, and therefore he'd rather go to his death rather than, pay a fine or admit that in any way he had done wrong. He had only upheld the state. And then they got angry and condemned him to death by a larger vote, because everybody assumed he would just escape and leave.
So
I'm sorry to have to cut you off because I have to. What, you have a question?
Yeah.
2 more questions and then because I want to go home.
What about me?
Bob, I'm curious about your exemplary, personal favorite modern society that's hedonistic and sexually progressive.
Oh my God! I don't think it
favorite.
exists.
I'm saying your favorite.
Your personal.
What's your
I mean,
perfect?
a real society?
Your favorite pervert, basically. Which
It's society. Oh my God! Well, I used to like places that aren't there anymore, but I used to hang out in. Well, I can't talk in public about these things, but I used to hang out in North Africa a lot when it was a great place. Read The Immoralist by Gide, and you get an idea of what l'Afrique du Nord used to be like. It was like ancient Athens. It was amazingly, or southern Italy before this whole influx of breaking up everybody into niches of gay, straight, and everybody had to name what they are. Even Freud has a very interesting footnote. Freud, who was more responsible than anybody for getting us to label everything we do. And Freud has a very interesting footnote, a very famous footnote in his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, in which he says, the Greeks didn't use prefixes. Sex was simply eros, and whatever you did was okay. As long as it was love and not something detrimental to the other person. You were supposed to validate the other person and make their life better through love. All right? So, I can't think of any place. Can you think of any place, Dennis?
not at the moment.
Outside my own house, no.
Hello. I'll get you, Joe, in a second. Jane.
Yeah, well, I just want to see if this works. No.
I'll do the jokes, Jane.
Okay. Thank you.
I just want to ask about that book you mentioned by Engels, The Origins of the State, the Family and Private Property. I'm probably one of the few people in this room that have read that book, and I'm just wondering, what does it have to do with the depiction of the human body in art?
Well, it's not about art. It's not about art. It's about sexuality and why we got the cult of virginity, patriarchy, the whole cult of repression, so that we could use surplus eroticism for work. What really Marx talks about in Engels is how society has forced us to translate erotic creative energy, which should be going into Schiller's play element, into repression so that we can work. In fact, if you go back to even the Weber's The Rise of Capitalism and the Spirit of Protestantism, or the other way around, I always forget which way it is. The other way around, right, yeah. What he points out is what Protestantism did was universalize the asceticism of the monastery to the whole society. So that if you keep controlling your sexuality and repressing it, you can funnel that, as Freud would say, sublimate it into the accumulation of profit, which is, even Freud said, money never gives you happiness because it is not one of the primal desires. It is not one of those things we most want physically, somatically, as part of our bodies.
He should speak for himself.
Well, Freud loved money. He was obsessed. He said at one point, he said, money is to me like ether gas. Anyway.
I'm getting that sign that's the sign.
Okay, we're moving out.
So what I'm just going to do is, Joe, we'll get to your question, but I want to just close the show first. I want to thank you again, Bob.
Thank you.
It was great.
I may not be able to come here again, I realize.
Oh, you'll be able to. You've been watching New York City Atheists Live on Tape, brought to you by New York City Atheists Incorporated. I've been your host, Dennis Horvitz. Please join us again next week. Thanks for watching.